Hello and welcome to the American Council on Exercise live continuing education series. My name is Jackie Crockford and I will be your host for today's live webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. You are watching today for free on YouTube and we appreciate you taking the time out to join us. If you would like to receive CECs for today's presentation, you can do so by using the link on your screen. After today's presentation is over, you will receive a follow-up email. And if you would like to purchase CECs, a recorded version will be in your ACE account once you purchase, and then you'll take a quiz and receive 0.1 CECs within your ACE account. Also, because you are watching live on YouTube, if you have questions during today's presentation, make sure and use the chat bar. I'll be monitoring those throughout the presentation, and if you have questions for our presenter, we'll be taking those questions towards the end of today's webinar. All right, let's get started. Welcome to your course, the ACE IFT Model for Group Fitness Instruction. My name is Jackie Crockford and I will be your host for today's course. And joining me today is our presenter, Garrett Stangel. Garrett. Hi.
Hi, Jackie.
How's it going?
Life is good.
Life is good. All right, so today we're going to be talking with you, one of our master trainers, about the ACE IFT model. And we know it started from personal training rather, but we're going to be talking about it from a group fitness perspective. So tell us why that is kind of an important combination for our group fitness instructors to be learning about.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, the same complexity exists in group dynamics as it does in personal training. We have all the same hurdles to jump, all the same programming challenges. So with that in mind, we need a toolkit. We need some way to systematically work on it. So the IFT gives us that.
Right. So if you have questions about the IFT model, this is a great course for you to be looking in on and how to apply that as a group fitness instructor. Right?
Absolutely.
So we have a couple of models joining us today. Some group fitness participants, Terry and Roberto, are going to be coming out in a little while.
They sure will.
All right, so let's get started.
All right, thank you. All right, so welcome everybody and thank you for joining us on today's webinar from all over the place. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we've got people tuning in from Miami to California and even Taiwan. So thank you all for taking an hour out of your day to join us. As Jackie had said, we're introducing the IFT model today specifically as it applies towards group instruction. In order to do so, we're going to be taking a look at and explaining some of the key components of the ACE IFT model and looking at how we apply them to group training. We'll discuss how individual client needs can be progressed and regressed into this same programming. And we're going to be going through some of the critical underutilized movement patterns and modalities that we want you including in your programming. But first, let's start off with a few definitions. So what makes group training different? Personal training is a one-to-one instructor ratio. One trainer, one client. Partner training gives us 2 clients to every instructor, and our small group dynamic leads us 3 to 10 participants per instructor. And obviously group, you know it, you're doing 10 or more, probably 20, 30, 40, 50 people in each class at a time. So far more complexity, far more challenge to orchestrate that many people through all of the things that we're going to talk about today. But I know you're up to the task. That's not the only thing that makes group different. And I know you know this better than I do probably. But why train in groups? It's the energy. It's the fun. It's the connections with other people. That's what drives us into those groups. It's also, per dollar, more watts and more calories burned during that same time. So it's a great cost value, but you can get all the energy and all of the fun of group dynamics along with the high quality instruction and leadership and accountability of some of today's best instructors, all married together in one. But the question is, are we doing too much or not enough? In the current trends, we have swung from our traditional training parameters, where we worked cardiorespiratory aerobic fitness, And we've really swung now, and the pendulum has swung towards anaerobic training. Ever since the birth of Tabata and high-intensity intervals, we've been seeing more and more of that show up in our classes. And while that's not a problem for some of our participants, it may not be an appropriate place to be for a lot of them. We're still going to talk about and build in muscular strength and endurance regardless of which contemporary model or traditional model we're using, and we're still going to talk about flexibility. But let's see what more we can do by moving into a newer paradigm. So our contemporary training parameters, there's a lot more complexity, there's a lot more going on that we want to consider for our programming. And the ACE IFT both challenges you and provides a framework for you to be able to use all of those different parameters seamlessly and progressively into your group programs, beginning with health behavior change. And I would ask, in all of the classes that we've been providing and all of the innovations that we've been bringing to the industry, are we winning the battle? Are we accomplishing the mission of getting more people moving? Statistically, we're really not. Still about 80% of the population is not getting it done for the recommended minimums that we'd like to see. So we have to go beyond teaching classes to switching health behavior. And so to do that, ACE and the IFT model are going to look at three distinct domains, and that'll be psychology, physiology, and emotions, to try and create that complete stimulation, that complete program for our participants. From there, we'll work into stability and mobility, identifying which joints should be moving and which ones should be locked in place when we're going through and learning different movement patterns, and looking at what dysfunction in those areas may do to throw off movement patterns and movement efficiency. We'll still take a look at balance work and core conditioning, and we're going to come back to cardiorespiratory fitness, but we're going to do that not just with a focus on the anaerobic, nor the old focus on aerobic, but we're going to look at both and how do we utilize them and dictate how we're going to use them based on metabolic markers. In addition to that, we'll still program for muscular strength and muscular endurance and flexibility, but now I'm going to challenge you to think about how do we get into agility, rapid changes of direction, coordination, reactivity, speed and power, all with our clients in mind. It's normally saved for a performance arena, and we'll talk a little bit about that continuum, but are there ways to regress it and make sure that it is also being utilized in some ways for our entry-level participants? So I ask, are those contemporary parameters all appropriate for your clients? And feel free to chime in on the webinar if you've got, you're working with different populations. As you're programming, are you also considering all of these parameters at some point? Or are you still staying largely with that old model? So let's take a look at the ACE IFT model and see how it is laid out, and then we'll tease it down and drill down into it to see how we can utilize it. So initially here, our ACE IFT model gives us an overview. That overview ranges from a continuum of function to health, to fitness, to performance. And as we're looking at that continuum, we're going to be meeting different needs. Now this is not discrete. You don't close the door on one and move into the next one. They flow in and out, and even your performance participants may still need functional stuff and health stuff. So your programming will be a little convoluted in that way, but follow along and I think we'll clarify. The IFT model is broken down into 4 phases. In phase 1, from a movement standpoint, we're looking at stability and mobility, and we'll talk about that shortly. And we're working on aerobic training in the cardiorespiratory fitness domain. Aerobic training, meaning with oxygen. Phase 2, health outcomes, we're targeting movement training, targeting certain movement patterns and still staying aerobic, but now the heart rates come up a little bit and we work them a little bit further into that zone. In our 3rd phase, we're targeting and talking largely about fitness. Now, this is the first time that we're introducing loads to those movement patterns. We've already got them moving, but now we're adding in some additional resistance, bands, weights, whatever it might be, to create an additional stress and to challenge those movement patterns further. This is also the first time that we see anaerobic training, anaerobic endurance training, meaning that we're now getting up into those oxygen debt zones. We're getting into a place where you just don't have the breath available and coming back down to recover. Again, I didn't mention that in the earlier phases because it's not going to be the kind of training that we're going to apply to everybody. And we have to figure that out. Who is this appropriate for and who is it not? And then lastly, our phase 4 gets into performance. And this is the phase that potentially most of our participants may not see. Depends on who you're working with. But this is an elite status here. This is a tough place to get to, and it means that everything else is largely working prior to it. But in this place, from a movement standpoint, we're moving into speed, agility, and quickness. We're doing plyometrics and power moves and potentially Olympic lifting and things like that. In the anaerobic power, from a cardiorespiratory fitness standpoint, we're going into those highest maximal outputs on the heart rate zone and then coming back down again for recovery. So that's a little snapshot of our IFT model. And notice that along the bottom in your graphic, we've also got rapport. And that starts from the beginning to the end. No matter who you're working with, we're always cultivating rapport. To do our programming properly, in order to use this IFT as a tool for your programming, we need to take a look at some entry points for this, some primary successful training stages that we're going to utilize, being rapport, investigation, planning, and action. From a rapport standpoint, this is that love and connection. Do you have a relationship with your participants? Do they know that you're there for their best interests, and do they trust you? From an investigation standpoint, this is that psychology, physiology, and emotional that we talked about with the health behavior. Are you engaging them in some way, coming to find out what's on their mind, what is their history and their training age of their body, and emotionally, how do they feel attitude-wise about movement, exercise, their goals? Then we move into planning. And this is the sights and the sounds, the movements and the memories. This is everything that you're going to orchestrate together to bring life to that class, to engage people and to leave them with those wow moments that bring them back the next time. And then we're into action, where we're executing that plan and we're reevaluating that plan to make sure it's having the kind of outcome that we had originally intended for our participants. So back to our IFT model, we're going to go now into rapport. So on our next slide, I ask, how well do you know your participants? Are they just facial recognition? You've seen them around and you're familiar with them? Do you know them, any of them by name? Or have you spent some time with them? Have you learned to appreciate them and respect them, admire them for their struggles and for what brings them to the gym today? Okay? In terms of stages of developing rapport, it is a heck of a lot easier to work one-on-one with people. You've only got one person to get to know. You've only got one person to sense the vibe on. But in the group dynamic, there's a lot more moving parts. So it's a bit more challenging, but I'm going to encourage you to spend time not just in class, but obviously on either end of class to try and engage those participants. Initially, I asked, do you know them by name? Do you know them by face? Do you know them by name? And do you know them by who they are? So in terms of casual acquaintance, it's our first stage of rapport. And this is where dialogues all start. This is where that initial meeting begins. And people give you the cliche answers. How are you today? Good. Are you good? I ask people all the time if they're living the dream. It usually throws them off guard, but they're willing to play with me on it. Close is our next one, where it goes a little bit deeper. We're getting to know not just the superficial answers that they're willing to give us, but with that closer relationship, they're willing to tell us a little bit more about what they're thinking, what their attitudes and beliefs are. Okay? As we move from there into a more intimate relationship, they're going to tell us now about how they're feeling. And if we continue to progress in that relationship to one of complete openness, they'll even tell us what they want and what they need. Okay? So your challenge is going to be to spend a little bit of time before and after and tune into them during those workouts to try and really figure out how do we elevate our relationship. Not just on that surface, but really getting to know those people and trying to get them to come back for more. So how do we do that? How do we build that rapport? Well, ultimately we've got to break the ice somehow. My "Are you living the dream" is both an icebreaker as well as a legitimate question. You're going to engage them on non-controversial small talk initially. Maybe it's the weather. Maybe it's "How are you today?" Maybe it's a sports team or something that's popping up in the news. But then, once you get them to engage, you're listening. Listening with your ears, listening with your heart, listening with your soul. Really trying to hear what they have to say or what they're not saying. Okay? Once we've done that, try and inject a little humor. If you've got a natural gift for it, it makes it a heck of a lot easier. But humor can be a great de-inhibitizer and a great way to break the ice for people. Beyond that, watch your nonverbals, both yours and theirs. If you're coming into my class and I'm standing here at the door like this, probably is not going to send the most inviting tone. So making sure that you're keeping an open posture, making sure that you're keeping a friendly vibe, making sure that you are making eye contact, but not in a creepy way, not too long. Make eye contact, but be engaged, but don't stare at people. And then we move into empathy. Shared experiences. You share in their struggle, you get their pain, you understand that they're here to accomplish a mission, to do something important for themselves. If you're doing group exercise with them and you're actually moving in the class and you're feeling the burn when they're feeling the burn and you're struggling when they're struggling, there's a built-in empathy there. But if you're one of those coaches that's standing back and you're watching the dynamic of the room and you're moving people but not doing the actual workout, you can still keep that same kind of empathy connection by how you communicate to them, by how you touch, by how you make eye contact, by the responses that you give. So this moves us to our second stage of successful training, which is investigating. So in order to do our program justice, we need to know more. We've broken the ice. We've got an in now to engage with that participant, but we need to know a little bit more to be able to program appropriately for them. So I'm going to ask you, chime in on the webinar, but do you use assessments to baseline and identify needs? Are you using PAR-Qs? Are you using health and activity histories? Are you using cardiovascular disease risk stratifications? Are you using attitudes questionnaires? How do you get to know the needs of your participants? Beyond that, if you've got new people coming into your class today, what do you know about them? Are you doing any sort of pre-class functional movement screens? Are they doing benchmark workouts? Are you tracking any sort of relevant data for them? And that also goes into the next one, which is how do you guarantee that the people that have been with you for the last year are making the kind of progress that you're programming for? In those cases, are you tracking data? Do you do body comp work? Do you do heart rates? Tracking those zone changes? Are you looking at their wattage outputs or awarding points for their calorie burn? How are you measuring progress? All right. From that investigation piece, once we know some things, we can move into planning. And I'll ask you again to think about what were the first two stages I mentioned. Planning is stage 3. First one was rapport. Second one, investigation. All right, and then we move into planning. So let's take a look again at our IFT model. And we're going to drill down now into functional movement and resistance training. So we'll take a closer look at stability, mobility, the movement training, and how that plays into load and beyond. At this time, I'm also going to invite our models. Both Terry and Roberto are going to come and join me, and we'll take them through a few of these movements. All right, welcome, you two. How are we?
Good.
All right, let me give you some PVC to start us off with. All right, and what we're going to do initially, in terms of the kinetic chain, we get alternating patterns throughout the body of areas of stability and areas of mobility. What does that mean? Stable means that we can control and hold them in position. Mobility means that we're free to move throughout the range of motion. So we're going to start from the top down today. Normally we like to build up, but because I've handed them PVC, makes sense. Let's start with demonstrating shoulder mobility. So if you would, shoulder pass-throughs, working back, coming down, coming forward. It shouldn't be a struggle, but if it is, it might be indicative that we've got some sort of limitations on our shoulder mobility. In terms of the range for that, you're really holding onto the PVC somewhere between hand to hand, from elbow to elbow, okay, that length. And as we're moving, you should have good mobility through your shoulders. If it's not there, we're going to find that the stable joints are going to have to compensate. So let's take a break there. Let's demonstrate a little stability. We'll set those down. We're going to move now into a plank position, your best, highest quality plank position for camera. And what we're looking for is scapular stability here. If the shoulders have to move, then the scapula have to be able to hold a fixed position. And so those shoulder blades shouldn't be winging up at the midline here. They should be held fixed against the thoracic cavity. And if we're encouraging them to move laterally or front and back, they should still be able to maintain that stable position. Okay, let's take the break there. So that demonstrates, and we can stay still down on the floor, but that was a scapular stability. Now we want thoracic mobility. So let's go from here back into 4-point position, and I want you to reach through and then come up and rotate. And let's see how that thoracic spine moves in this particular movement pattern. All right, and you can see how neatly and smoothly they flow. They've got good range of motion throughout their thoracic spine, and that's a great place for us to start. Let's come back to stopping. Hands are going to be on the floor. And now I want to look at lumbar stability by having you do some hip circles. So concentrate on keeping the pelvis still, the lumbar locked in place, and we're going to pick one knee up and make big circles with it. Now, in order for this to work, you've got to be keeping your abdominals engaged, you've got to be holding that pelvis flat, and then you're working the range of motion of the hip from there. And those hips should make big sweeping circles without needing the pelvis to tilt and rotate in order to make that happen. Okay? Good. Let's take the break there. Coming from there, let's stand back up. So the hips are a unique one. Not only do they need to have mobility, but they also need to be able to have stability. Certainly a lot of that's going to come from our feet and our footwear, but if you've got hips that aren't able to hold good stability, then you get the knees drifting in, and now you're going to create additional movement problems. So with that, let's take a look at squatting as your pattern here. So just working our way down into a good squat. And I'm again looking for a few different things. This is a hinge joint. It should flex and extend as he squats down and up. All right, thank you, Roberto. We'll take a couple more. Terry's got her squat. Those knees are tracking right over the feet. There's no lateral or medial deviation. So those hips are stable and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, let's take the break there. And from the next one here, we know that the knees are doing their hinge as they should. How's the mobility of your ankles? We can see it in a squatting pattern. I can see it when they're squatting down nice and low. Is that lower leg hinging forward at the ankle like it should? And as we're making even circles, do these move nice and smooth? Are they cracking and popping? Are they stuck in certain ranges? We're laughing because we can hear the crackling. And from here, let's take the break and let's try one last one, kicking off those shoes and looking at if we've got mobile ankles, do we also have stable feet? So feet, we should be able to have good ground contact from the front to the back, from the medial to the lateral sides, And if we go up to a single leg balance, one leg coming up as high as you can, we should be able to maintain that lifted arch, maintain good balance and support. And if not, it tells us that we need to make sure that we're encouraging good activation of the feet or good footwear to help protect them in the meantime. Let's come back down from there, and we'll invite you back out in a moment. All right, so from a kinetic chain standpoint, again, we move in alternating segments and responsibility from stable in the foot to mobile in the ankle, stable in the knee, mobile in the hips, stable in the low back, mobile in the thoracic spine, stable scapula, mobile in the shoulders. Okay, a lot of parts to think about, but consider that for your programming, and as you're watching people move, are they getting that kind of movement? Because if something is compromised, it's going to come at the expense of something else, the next one up or down. So with that being said, this might be the perfect place to spend your time in class. Your class might be focused purely on kinetic chain work, on stability and mobility. But even if it's not, even if you're doing performance work with people on the other end of the continuum, you could be using kinetic chain work as an opening segment, pre-workout or warm-up, to get them primed, to get them moving, and then to ramp them up into whatever the workout entails. All right? We're going to get Roberto and Terry back out here, and we're going to pull a few movement patterns into play. All right. I apologize, our other 45 models for today's class weren't here and available. So we're going to work with 2 in our small space, but the idea is there. Imagine that we're working a bigger class and we've got more participants going, okay? We're going to keep the movement patterns small and simple. We're going to stick with some basic patterns. There are different schools of thought. There are going to be people who say that they come by a different name, but we're targeting all of the major movement patterns. We've got 5 listed for you today, and then there's also combination patterns that take those all and build from combinations of other movements. So for right now, let's start off. We'll start off with a traditional deadlift, and we'll start off with a stiff leg deadlift, okay? So on our movement pattern here, that arm is going to stay nice and long, and you're going to work down into that squat and back up. Arms stay long and just hooking on to that PVC. We're coming down and we're coming up. And I'm looking here at Roberto to make sure that those arms are long, just hooking into the weight, that his spine remains neutral, that his pelvis is in a stable position as he's going through the movement pattern, that his knees are tracking, and that his ankles are moving the way that they should. As I'm looking to Terry, same deal. She's going to keep a slight bend in her knees, really hinging mostly at the hips, keeping a neutral spine, keeping the shoulder blades retracted and controlled throughout the movement pattern. If we can't do this without weight, we shouldn't be adding weight into it. So we're looking at these purely from a movement pattern standpoint right now. Okay? Let's take a break there and let's move into a single leg variation. So now adding an extra degree of difficulty. Instead of having that solid base of support, we're going to a single leg. I'm going to have Roberto do a single leg RDL, or Romanian deadlift, so that leg stays long and straight while you hinge at your hips. And I'll have Terry take hers into a squat where she's bending at the knee. So largely the opposite 2 movement patterns that they were working just before, but now into a single leg variety. And again, on both of these movements, they're balancing exercises. So I'm more concerned with the alignment of their posture and the stability of the joints that they're working than I am about how far they're going into range of motion. I'd rather see them not fall over and be victorious than for me to have to pick them back up and then adjust the exercise. So let's take the break here. And let's try a push. So we'll set those PVC pipes down for the moment, and let's try chaturanga style push-up and a more traditional push-up. Now pushes can be horizontal in this case, where it is horizontal to the torso, or it can be a vertical movement where we're pressing overhead. So in this case, we're looking again, can they keep and maintain that scapular stability? Can they recruit the muscles that we're trying to recruit of the chest, of the shoulders, of the arms in order to make this movement pattern happen? Okay? And only taking the best quality of any movement pattern, shutting down before we deteriorate. So let's take that break. And we'll move from here into some pulling patterns. So we'll come back to our PVC. And let's have you go 2-arm and single arm here on these bent over rows. So hinging into that movement pattern, squeezing those shoulder blades together, pulling those elbows up, whether it is a single arm variation or 2 arms at a time. All right, and again, all those same things hold true. We got to be able to see that the knees are going to stay in good position, giving us clues about what the hip or ankles are doing. We want to make sure that those spines are staying in neutral position, and even head and neck, tucking the chin just slightly down to try and maintain neutral alignment while we're working through that major musculature of the upper back, back of the shoulders. Okay? And let's take a break there. And last but not least, let's show a rotation. So I'll have you go, Terry, with a wood chop, taking this one out, which is really more of a combination movement because she's also going to get a little bit of this single leg split squat action going. And Roberto, if you would, please, let's take you down to the mat and show a supine twist. So laying on your back, arms out to the side, palms up, and rotating the knees down to the side. All right. Good, good, good. And Roberto's got his elbows bent, which is okay. It narrows his base of support, making that a little trickier. He's probably also trying to give Terry a little space. It's all good. But so now here's a rotational movement. And again, you know that in some of your programming, you've already got a wide variety of these movement patterns in there. Realize that there are progressions and regressions for all of these. All right. So let's take the break there. We'll stop there, and I will thank you very much. We'll come back to you in just a bit. All right. So we talked about kinetic chain. We talked about movement patterns. Now, in order to go further, we have to talk about physiological principles that are largely governing our programming. The first one being the overload principle. Adaptations in a human being happen by strategically increasing the stress. It's kind of the cool thing about the human body. There's not an engineer out there that can design a bridge that gets stronger with more cars driven over it. But the human body adjusts to those stress loads. As long as we're giving a little bit more stress than what the body is used to, it's going to adapt to it. Okay? That's important, though, as we consider stress and recovery, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But in that overload principle, don't think about how high do I have to shoot. Think about what's the minimum amount of stress that you could give somebody to successfully take them into overload. Our next principle is specificity. That if we're manipulating variables with overload, maybe it's percentages of max force, maybe it's time under tension, maybe it's sets and reps, maybe it's the speed of movement. Our specificity principle says that it matters which variable we're manipulating. If we're manipulating the speed of movement, the outcome that we're looking for is to make faster movers. So if that's the outcome that we're striving for, faster movement, we've got to train it in a specific way. General strength training isn't going to provide that. Working muscular endurance isn't necessarily going to make people faster movers. So we have to stress the appropriate system to get the appropriate outcome. The way that we do that and the way ACE encourages you is progression. 2 by 2. If in the resistance world, in the movement patterns and loads, if people can do 2 more repetitions with good quality on 2 successive sets, then you go ahead and increase the load or the complexity of a movement pattern. If you're not seeing that, stay with it. Mastery before progression. In the cardiorespiratory world, we're working on certain heart rate thresholds, we're working on certain steady states, certain intervals, and again, making incremental progressive increases, 2% in this week, 2% next week, trying to make subtle incremental changes. In addition to that, we're also recognizing that when the quality has come down by as little as 10% or as much as 10%, we want to shut down the exercise and move then into something that we can perform successfully. And the last piece of it is reversibility. And the principle of reversibility is the old use it or lose it. You know it, you hate it because you work so hard to get somewhere and then it's so easy to lose. But it's really about balancing your work and recovery ratios. So you are doing the work and making sure there's enough rest and recovery to allow the adaptation to occur. Too much rest or too little rest and you will see reversibility. If there's too little rest, it's overtraining and you're going to see the decline in your own training and in that of your class. If there's too much rest, we decondition, not enough overload. That's for the case of those one week people that come into class this week and you're not going to see them, they're not going to do anything else for the next week. They're not going to be making progress because they're not coming in frequently enough. So use that principle to help program and to get into their psychology to come in a little more often. All right. So a perfect example of the progression and regression that I keep mentioning is looking at balance and agility in a continuum. So agility is normally reserved for a performance arena. That is, an agility exercise is a performance-oriented, sports-specific type of an activity. It's really about how fast can you change directions. Balance, in a subtler way, is also about controlling the change of direction, but in a low-impact way. So I'm going to ask that Roberto and Terry come back out and they give us a look at balance and agility here. I'll give you that one, and we'll give you that one. And if we can, let's start off maybe with a simple single leg step up. And for Roberto, I'll have you start with that seated balance and we'll move to a standing balance. So in both cases, we're working on progressions from here. So Roberto initially, he moved from a wide base of support to a narrow base of support, and then he worked to increasing his center of mass and adjusting his line of gravity by adding some arm movements in there. Okay? He's changing his focal point so that he's throwing off his ability to use his eyes as an anchor for his balance. Okay? He can then progress those same strategies up into a standing balance. Now Terry is working here with a dynamic balance. She's moving from a static position that Roberto's working with into a transfer from base of support here to a base of support on one leg on the box. As she's doing that, she can add in some of the same challenges that Roberto's doing. Base of support is a given, but she could be changing her movement patterns from our sagittal plane to frontal plane, lateral movements. She could add in a step behind for a transverse movement. Okay? She can be adding arm changes. You're good. You're good. She could be adding in arm changes with a reach. She could be adding in focal point adjustments where she's taking her eyes off of a topic. But the challenge here is, again, only as much as we can do successfully and masterfully. Now, she is doing well with her dynamic balance, so I'm going to ask her to move it to an agility move. So let's keep that top foot planted. And what I want you to do is, as best you can, as soon as you come down, decrease the amortization, decrease the amount of time that you're spending on the ground, and you're quickly transitioning back up. All right? So now this has become a quick change of direction movement, so it's a subtle way to build agility in without having a ton of impact. All right? Thank you very much, and we'll be back. All right. So, as I've said, balance and agility live on opposite ends of the spectrum. And whether you're working balance work for function, for health, for fitness, or you're working agility performance, there may be a way to progress and regress these in order to bring those to the target population. Okay? The very same way that we look at the progression of movement patterns, and soon the way we'll talk about the movement of cardiorespiratory training. So, as we look again at our IFT model, we'll take a look next at cardiorespiratory fitness and how we can program for that. All right, so HIT is not it. It is one tool in the toolbox, but it's not the only thing we can draw from. Since the advent of the Tabata and the high-intensity interval training, classes have grown by leaps and bounds using this specific modality. But again, it's not the only way to go about things. So as we look at the graphic on your slide, you have exercise intensity on one axis, you have minute ventilation on the other axis. And we're looking specifically at how the increases in exercise intensity lead to increases in heart rate and breathing. As we move into ventilatory threshold 1, we're getting to a place where it's becoming difficult to talk, where if you're carrying on a conversation, you're having to pause to exhale sharply at that point every 7 to 8 words. If we're working with people who are in a stage 1 functional category, we're really trying to target building that ventilatory threshold for them, trying to create a nice gap between the resting heart rate and that ventilatory threshold. So in order to do that, we want to get them up to ventilatory threshold, up to that talk test, but just to slowly push that ceiling up. We don't want to spike them over the top of that. And this is critically important because if they don't have an aerobic base, they don't have the mitochondria to continue to use oxygen, they don't have the ability to continue to breathe, to recover at those higher intensities. So we want to make sure that we've built a good, safe foundation for them. In addition to that, we want to make sure that we're doing that systematically. So initially, if people are doing, let's say they're doing 10 minutes of cardio, 5-minute increments, 10-minute increments, whatever it might be, we want to work on building frequency first, then building that duration, adding more and more time volume in, and then adjusting into intensity. So be thinking about that also in a very sequential manner. Beyond that, if we're moving into the health realm, now we're going to flirt with those intervals. We'll play with an interval just slightly 5 to 10 beats higher than ventilatory threshold or 5 to 10 beats lower than ventilatory threshold, just bouncing up and down between those 2 points to create some additional demand, but still allowing recovery. Finally, if we're moving into fitness or performance, now we're moving up to ventilatory threshold 2 and beyond. This is where that onset of blood lactate happens. This is where that burning sensation gets up and just doesn't seem to relent. And that's where a lot of that HIIT work is already taking us. But it's appropriate for some of our fitness participants and for performance participants, but we have to be able to probably walk things back down a little bit for our function and health people. All right, looking at it another way, here is our a second graphic that gives us a look at the use of training zones for that and what type of modalities we'd use. Now imagine also that there's an aerobic base underneath aerobic efficiency. And that's our stage 1 people. And that's a sub-VT1. That's just at that ceiling right below VT1. And we would do that largely through steady state work. If we're working aerobic efficiency, now we're moving just above and just below, as I'd mentioned, using steady state work or aerobic intervals. Once we get into the anaerobic endurance work, now we're spiking as high as zone 3, above ventilatory threshold 2, and coming back down into zones 2 and 1, possibly back down below ventilatory threshold for those recoveries. By the time we work into the anaerobic power zone with our performance athletes, now we're spiking again in zone 3, coming back down to 1 and 2, but we're doing it using speed and agility and quickness drills, using multi-directional quickness stuff. It's not so much steady state, it's not so much straight line work with those populations. All right. So this moves us into action. We have talked about the building of rapport. We've looked at investigation to find out more about our participants. We've looked at the use of planning, the IFT for planning. And now we're looking at, well, how do we bring this to life? So here's a sample format on this slide that gives you a look at a sports conditioning approach to a group fitness model, where we begin with dynamic warm-ups that could include balance drills, it could include self-myofascial release or some movement pattern training. And then we move into some low-intensity drills. Maybe that's where you move into balance. Maybe that's where you move into some low-level, low-impact agility work or reactivity stuff. For today's workout, we'll demonstrate a core conditioning segment during that part. Then into power and speed and quickness. These are high-intensity pieces. They take a good time to get to the warm-up of them, and they're going to be limited capacities. So we don't want to spend all day, and we don't want to throw them in at the end. We want to use speed and power work when the energy is there. Moving then into strength or cardio, lower intensities, lower overall demand, before potentially some more exhaustive type, higher intensity, agility, coordination, reactivity. Again, if you're not working with people in stage 4 performance, you won't even need to incorporate that. Then that's other things in your programming. That's where your core work's coming in. That's where your endurance intervals are coming in. That is where you might be going back to stability, mobility work, discontinuing after the strength and cardio circuits, and now moving into recovery work and post-exercise flexibility. Okay? With that in mind, let's take a look at what this looks like flowed out over a 1-hour class, where we're spending potentially 10 to 15 minutes doing dynamic warm-ups, 5 to 7 minutes doing low-intensity drills, agility, reactivity, coordination, 20 to 25 doing speed and power work, followed by high-intensity drills and or cool down. Now realize that we can move speed and power to replace lower intensity drills. We could plug in strength, muscular strength and endurance work in that speed power or the high intensity drill section. This is largely plug and play, but I want you thinking about energy systems as you're doing it. Your participants are not going to have power at the end of their workout necessarily. So be thinking about the biggest power pushes early on in the workout. Think about strength in the middle, and think about endurance-oriented work towards the end. All right, so let's bring out Roberto and Terry again, and we'll get them engaged for not just the warm-ups this time and the assessments this time, but we'll actually go through and do a little bit of a workout. So we'll break down our class the same way we broke them down in the slides, but we're only going to see them for little short segments, unfortunately. Sad. But we'll get through it. So here we go. We're going to start off with a little warm-up. We're going to do some dynamic flexibility and balance stuff. So let's start off, big reach out, big knee hug in. Now I'm setting a tone for our class. I want the music going. I want the lights going. I want to make sure that my voice can be heard so that I can be coaching and cueing right now. And we're looking at everything that we've talked about so far, making sure that the feet are holding them stable, that they've got good posture, that they're bringing those knees up as high as they can rather than letting the chest collapse down onto the knees. We're looking for full energy, full engagement at this point already. Now, we're going to go from there into a glute stretch. Let's take that ankle over the knee, and let's work down into that squat and back out. Now, if your participants need to be using assistive aids, PVC or whatever, or the wall, so be it. You know your population. Hopefully, you're seeing what they can and cannot do, and you're making sure that they have good victories here and throughout the workout. From here, let's move ourselves down into a low lunge. We'll come down into this low lunge, hips up with a nice long spine, hips down, and then add that thoracic rotation. And I will get out of your way. All right, so we're working through that range of motion. Again, this is part flexibility, this is part balance. So we're working a few different strategies in here right away. All right, let's leave that one alone. Let's come back up. And now moving laterally across the floor, down into a squat, slide, and pick those knees up to step over. Let's imagine we've got a hurdle right here, and we are trying to duck underneath it, and then there's another hurdle that we want to step over. And why don't we come on over here? Let's make sure that the camera gets a good one at you, and let's go from right to left, from my right over here to the left, facing in. go. Step over right, step over left. All right. So we'll move from here. One last one that we'll throw in before we actually get into the work is let's go into a little bit of a warrior. Single leg RDL, hinging forward and coming back out, hinging forward and coming back out. Posture stays good. We're working first and foremost at alignment, secondly on balance, and then third on range of motion. If you don't have the first one, don't move to the second. If you don't have the second, don't move to the third. We want to make sure that we have those pieces. All right. Hopefully we're switching legs, we're getting both sides in, we're getting the work done and evenly on both sides, so that way we're getting them primed and ready for their workout. Well, this is already part of the workout because we've already got some of that flexibility and balance targeted. So now we're going to move from here. We're going to ramp things up into a core activation section. Let's come down to the mat. Join me down here. I'm going to have you keep your head on the mat. Tuck your chin just slightly. Push the low back down by sucking your belly button in. And I want you to press your hands against your thighs and push up. So a resisted dead bug in this particular one. And I'm going to have you hold that. Let's hold that continuously for 30 seconds. Pressing hard against it. Try and get a little ground clearance, bringing those tailbones up off the ground and working to hold that steady. Now, if my participants can't hold this for the whole time, then it's okay. Come out of it, relax, come back into it. We're working a timed interval here, so if you can't stay for the whole time, that's okay. Come out, come back in. All right? In this case, we're going to move from that one. Let's bring our feet down, heels hit the ground. Your heels are on the ground, but your toes are up. Knees are bent about 90 degrees. Suck in that belly button, and let's lift those hips. All right? And as you're lifting a hip, I want you to bring one foot and march it up to the ceiling. There we go. Now, I've already advanced them from going 2 feet on the ground up to a single leg. Now, it's important that in order for me to do that, I have to make sure that the abs are still staying engaged, that the lumbar spine is still stable, and that their hips are getting full range of motion. Because if we're losing any of that quality, then we regress right back down. There's no point in advancing just to make it harder. The goal isn't to make them sweaty. The goal is to help improve their function, to help them make their own medicine, to help them stimulate the best version of themselves. So we want to make sure that it's quality over quantity. All right? Let's leave this one alone. Let's do the trunk rotation that we did earlier, where your arms are going to be out, your knees are bent, and you're taking 2 knees to one side and back. So we're taking the core through its stability as well as ranges of motion, making sure that those intrinsic abdominal and intrinsic core muscles are ready to go for whatever else we throw at them. Also using this as part of our continued dynamic warm-up. And from here now, we'll be picking up the pace. We're going to be moving to some speed power. So let's come off of there. Let's break out our cones. And I'll have one of you behind the cones, one of you in front of the cones. Whew. All right, here we go. And let's go skater hops. Big step, big land. All right. Initially, this is a high impact variation. And if I'm truly working for speed and power, I'm going to say I want you going all out as hard as you can, as fast as you can, as far as you can for a short period of time. We also have the option of a lower impact variation that Terry's working with right now, keeping 1 foot continuously on the ground. This is working some agility and balance, not necessarily the speed and power, but we can play those same games in the same workout. All right, let's take the rest. I might have them working this 30 seconds of work on, 30 seconds of work off, 30 seconds of rest, going back and forth through those things. Now we're going to move into a strength phase. So we'll slow things down a little bit more. We're going to break out some PVC. Again, at least for our class today, we're doing movement pattern training more so than we are doing high intensity intervals. So why don't we start off with a little bit of strength training. Yep, getting a good base of support, keep that core engaged, pelvis tucked under, and we're going to start with a push. So you won't be able to see this, but Roberto is going to push, Terry's going to fight him on it, but she's still being a good partner and letting him get some work in, but letting him get the range of motion. Okay? Now this, we want to go slow. We're manipulating time under tension. That's where the stress comes from on this exercise. And if we're moving them a little closer, we can also get more range of motion. But we're going to take the break there from now. It's not going to look any different, but we're going to go now on a row. Okay? So let's do that same, align that same position, but now instead of pressing into it, now you're pulling back. So we're working that alternating antagonistic muscle groups. Pull and pull. Pull and pull. We're getting our breathing in. We've got good control of the movement. We're still maintaining good posture and good alignment while we're working through this. Now in this case, 5 to 10 repetitions. We stop, we take a rest. We might move back onto something else. We might come back to another one. In this case, take the break. Let's move it to a squat. So we'll go vertical with that PVC. Feet are in a good base of support, and you're not depending on your partner to hold you up. You are squatting in free space under your own power, and you are working laterally, pressing against that PVC to your left, to your right, and you are trying to create stress that your partner then is having to resist and avoid that rotational component while you're working through your squat. All right, come all the way to the top, squeeze those glutes at the top to get you all the way to the top. And we'll take that break there. Good. Thank you very much. Let's put this away. Let's stay with me, though. One more thing. So for this particular component, we're going to move to the mat. We're going to do a little core endurance work. I like to throw in challenges at the end for endurance, or maybe earlier for agility or power or strength, depending on the class format that we're working with. In this case, we'll come down to an endurance challenge. This would be a great time if you've got the equipment, if you've got the space, and you're doing 3 minutes of cardio drill and then a minute of recovery and then another 3-minute cardio drill. Great, go with it. If you've got equipment in your space that you can utilize, use what's at your disposal and think about what energy systems and what resources do we have available to work with. In this case, we're going to do a muscular endurance challenge. So let's come down, laying on your back. We were doing 30 seconds to 45 seconds before. Now we're going to go for 90 seconds. Going for a long endurance challenge and doing the best that we can with quality throughout that time. So let's start off with a dead bug or a layout type position, whether you're bringing up single arm and single leg or you're laying out both arms, both legs at the same time. So legs come up and then reach, all right? And now the challenge here is to keep that spine stable, keep that belly button pulled in, keep that core locked in place while we are reaching and extending throughout this whole thing. And I'm going to encourage them to change their breathing patterns just a little bit. So normally we're going to breathe out and we're going to breathe in. Now I want to take a couple of breaths when you're in that extended position and try and bring it back in. So we're increasing the time under tension. We're changing the speed of the movement. We're creating additional challenges without having to get really outside of this space. Okay? I'd have them work this for as best that they could for 90 seconds. Then let's take a break, 89, 90. Let's put your feet down, heels down on the ground, toes up. Get those knees as extended as you possibly can without locking them. Pull that belly button in, squeeze those butts, hips come up off the ground, and I want you to go palms up on this one. Yep. Now, if you need a little help, you can squeeze those elbows into the earth. If your posterior chain has enough strength and endurance, then you'll hang out there without the use of those elbows and arms. But now here we're working the back side of the body. So still a core strengthener, working the opposite side, core endurance work, a challenge that we could hold again for 60, 75, 90 seconds. Should we hang out here for 90 seconds? Sure, Terry's game for it, I think. All right, so with that, we'll cut this off. We'll take our break here. I'm going to encourage you to be thinking about your programming, but let's get rid of our models for the moment. I want to thank you so much. Hold on one moment. Let's close it out. I want to thank you for being here. On the count of 3, let's call Make It Count, okay? 3, 2, 1, Make It Count. All right. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate them bringing the exercises, the movements to life for us. So last but not least, and the reason we throw in that little piece is, again, what separates group training from personal training and even partner training is the interpersonal relationships, the dynamics of having more people and more energy in the same space. So in this case, that hand-on-hand contact, the energy feeding off of one another and playing and jousting with one another, helps to create an experience for our participants, not just a workout. Okay? Plan in your planning stage to engage all the senses, sights and sounds, smells and movements and personal interactions. How are you going to orchestrate all of that throughout your workout? Okay? Beyond that, make it memorable. The last 10 minutes of the workout are a critical time where the memory is formed about that workout. So if the last 10 minutes are wow, if it is a grand finale type of a finish, your participants are going to walk away thinking, wow, I can't wait to get back to this workout. If we kind of fade off and fizzle off towards the end, that might be the opinion that they form, the memory that they retain of that workout going forward. So keep that in mind. Create an experience. All right. Lastly, I drew from a few references here, both the ACE Personal Training Workshop and the ACE Sports Conditioning Workshop. There's a list of references here if you're looking for them. And without further ado, I'll invite Jackie back out. I want to say before you chime in, thank you so much to everybody who attended the webinar, sincerely. Your commitment to the people that you serve, your aspirations of growth to make a bigger impact on their lives means the world to me, means the world to us at ACE. So we sincerely appreciate your time and energy.
Definitely. Yes, I will second that. We appreciate everybody taking the time and lots of comments coming in, so thank you for chatting in. Great job, Garrett. This was a lot of information to cover. I know.
It's normally an 8-hour workshop.
Right, in only 1 hour, and our models did a great job. They're over here recovering nicely, so we appreciate everybody taking the time to watch today. So once again, you are watching today for free via YouTube. If you would like the opportunity to purchase CECs, I know that was a couple of questions coming in. If you want the opportunity to purchase the CECs, make sure and do that. After today's webinar is over, you will receive a follow-up email with more information on how to do that, and I'll check in on that with you in just a few moments here as well. So if you have questions, be sure and type those in right now. We will get to those questions in just a moment with Garrett, and up on your screen you will see a little bit more information on how to get in touch with Garrett if you do have further questions or you want to know what he's doing as far as other presentations and his work in Wisconsin. So
and elsewhere.
Yeah, and all over the country, really. So make sure and check in with Garrett. Also, we're going to be doing a live or a Facebook chat rather after today's webinar is over. So if you have further questions, you can check our ACE Facebook page, ACE Fitness on Facebook, and we'll be continuing the conversation about the IFT model and group fitness and any other questions that you have for Garrett there.
I look forward to it.
Yeah, any other courses that you might be interested in? We have a lot of other information that we offer here at ACE as far as CECs, some more courses around the IFT model, and a couple of partnership courses around group fitness. So if you are watching and a group fitness instructor, we have some other continuing education opportunities for you as well. So let's get to some of those questions. And Garrett, there were a few things that came in earlier, and I'm just going to roll back our slide to go through some of those questions that came in earlier. You talked about the 4 stages. We went through the developing rapport, we talked about investigation, the action, and the planning. And so coming back to the investigation part, this is something that we've mentioned and a couple of people have typed in around, it's really difficult to do the investigation as a group fitness instructor, right? So maybe not everybody is filling out all of the paperwork the same way that they might if they're a personal training client. So talk to us a little bit about that and other ways that we might be able to do the investigation if we don't have the time or the resources to do all that paperwork.
Sure. You know, I think you know, there's certainly in my own programming, we're working with definite beginning and end dates, you know, boot camp style, where we get an opportunity to see people come in day one and we can do pre-assessment and evaluation stuff. And that's great. If your club or if your program doesn't allow for that and you don't have that opportunity, there certainly is data that's already provided. People are already filling out these forms in terms of liability and all those things at your clubs. Potentially using a data management software that actually allows you to be able to give information about what are people's goals, for instance, and to be able to use a Survey Genius kind of a Survey Monkey type of a technique to be able to figure out, well, what do you know about them? The other thing that I encouraged in the webinar was, engage them as much as you can. You're seeing them after class. If you've got 15 minutes, can you talk with them a little bit? Create that relationship and find a little bit more about them. And over time, you're going to get to know a lot more of these people, and you'll understand what's driving them to come in.
Right. So really kind of using some of that rapport building is actually a little bit of the investigation as well, right?
If you don't have the rapport, you're not going to get the information. You're going to get the, I'm good, thanks for asking, and then that's it. Whereas if you actually, you took that 2 minutes and you gazed for just a little bit longer, they might tell you a little bit more about what's going on.
Right, and that's investigating.
Absolutely.
Great. So just checking in with a couple of other questions that have come in. We know that with group fitness, and Terry and Roberto did a good job of showing a couple of different variations. We know in group fitness classes it spans the gamut of abilities and fitness levels and experiences. So how can we, as far as power development, specifically that was a couple of questions that come in about power, how can we take some of the maybe exercises that we're choosing to do along with power and maybe regress or progress depending on who we have in the class?
Sure. So power is a capacity that ultimately we're trying to recruit as much force as we can in the most condensed time possible. So strength building is a way of working into that as long as we're keeping the loads lower, 40 to maybe 60% of that max output. So if you've got people who you can't quite figure out how to get them into power, maybe we're still working strength building with them, and that unlocks for the next one. The first thing that comes to mind for me when you're saying, how do we do this? One would be making sure that the class itself is clearly indicated that this is a class for people who are working stage 3, stage 4, or stage 4 specifically, so that way we're funneling a certain clientele into that. If we're trying to feed that power stuff back into our people, the same way that we worked in the function and the health stuff, we're trying to work power back into that. Look at it the same way we do the balance and agility continuum. So essentially walk it back to what are movements that we can work on recruiting speed in that safe environment. Even movement patterns where I'm going on a pressing movement, could I try and go faster into that movement pattern? Now, I don't have to have any additional load, I don't have to have additional ground reaction forces, but I can still ask my nerves and my muscular system to communicate for a quicker response.
You just did it right there.
Just did it right there.
Great. So different ways to progress and regress, and really taking the IFT model into consideration depending on the group that we're working with. Yeah,
there's so many variables. I mean, how else do you figure out what's going to come in, what's not going to come in, right? I mean, so, flowing it all out there and saying, what do we want to accomplish in today's workout, in this week's workout, in this month's workout, in this year's workout, and strategically and systematically plugging it in.
Perfect. Great way to end it. We will call it there, and we're going to be moving on to how you can purchase CECs. So if you take a look at your screen, you will see a little bit of a video to show you how to purchase the recorded version of today's webinar. Once again, you'll receive a follow-up email with this information, but if you want to go to our site, you can do that at acefitness.org and follow the links provided so that you can purchase the recorded version of today's webinar. You'll receive that in your MyAce account along with a quiz, and once you pass the quiz, you'll receive 0.1 CECs within your MyAce account. If you would like to join us again next month, we have another live webinar coming up with Pete McCall, and we're going to be talking about the fascial network and understanding that component of our system. And Garrett, once again, we are so appreciative of having you here, as well as our models. And we're going to be connecting with you again on the Facebook chat after today's webinar is over. And there's a variety of other ways that you can connect with ACE as well. Be sure and let us know what you thought about today's webinar and any other suggestions for topics that you'd like us to cover. Thank you for joining us. Let's get people moving.